Everyone wrestles with God at some point. Everyone wrestles with God. Today I want to talk about this story of Jacob wrestling this stranger who turns out to be God that we hear in our first reading from Genesis. Jacob, as you remember, is the son of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. He is kind of third in the lineage, but Jacob's ability to be there is actually a bit of a contentious and conflicted story, because Jacob is the twin brother of Esau. And if you know anything about lineage and heirs in ancient Israel, it was the firstborn son who received everything. The whole estate goes to the firstborn son, not to the daughter. It's not a 50-50 split if you're a twin. There's not some sort of negotiation with the will. It all goes to the firstborn son. So the problem was that when Jacob and Esau were born, Esau was actually born first. And so Jacob, as he gets older, and his mother scheme. They both think that Esau does not deserve to receive their father's inheritance. And so Jacob and his mom do this scheming, and when Isaac is of old age and he's blind, it's a great story that's not in our reading today. It's a great story about how Jacob goes to his father asking for the inheritance, asking for his blessing, and pretending to be Esau. And the father is tricked, and he ends up giving his inheritance, the birthright, to Jacob. And so Jacob now has all of the inheritance. Of course, then he realizes that it's going to get nasty with his brother Esau, and so he skips town. Esau is furious. He gets all of his friends, and they start chasing after him. And a couple of other stories later, and we come to today's story in Genesis. Esau is kind of far enough behind that Jacob can spend the night and be at peace for once. Now, so Jacob is not kind of the most savory character in the Old Testament. You're getting that impression. Yeah, he's a little bit of a schemer. He's a conniver. He's manipulative. He's ambitious. He's kind of a gunner. He wants what he wants. And so in the middle of the night, our reading begins. A figure shows up, this stranger, and they start to wrestle, which is a kind of a weird thing to do in the middle of the night with a stranger. I would not recommend it. But they wrestle in the middle of the night, and a couple of things happen, and I want to talk about a couple of those things. The first thing is that we don't know the identity until a little later in the night, when it's revealed by the narrator that this stranger is actually God. And now all of a sudden it makes sense that they were wrestling in the middle of the night, because in ancient Israel, if you were to look upon God's face, everyone knew that looking upon God's face would kill you. You would die if you saw the face of God. It's that holy. It's that kind of terrifying. And so to wrestle in the middle of the night means that Jacob can look at this figure and not die. But as they continue to wrestle, and just when you're listening to all this, you have to kind of allow your literal side to calm down. If you get real literal here, you're going to get yourself all topsy-turvy. How can God become a person and wrestle? And how come God's all-powerful? And doesn't God immediately defeat Jacob because of his all-powerfulness? And those are great questions. I have very thick books for you to read. Just ask me afterwards. But for those of us who can kind of let that go for a moment, just imagine here for a moment this situation where they're wrestling and they're evenly matched and they're kind of holding on one to another. And then God says, as the sun kind of starts to show signs of rising, God says, "Let me go, for day is breaking." Now, it's important to know why God is saying this. God is not saying this because he doesn't want Jacob to see him. God says this because he knows that if Jacob sees him in the light, Jacob will die. And so God says, you got to let me go. You're in mortal danger here if you don't let me go. It's going to be really bad for you. Which brings me to my first little kind of vignette about our wrestles with God. Our wrestling with God can take on many different forms. It can be spiritual and existential, and kind of like a prayer. We wrestle with God in our prayers about questions of meaning, questions of why. These typically come up around health issues, around family or relationship problems, around vocational questions, and sometimes they just kind of percolate up for no reason at all. And we find ourselves wrestling with our own purpose, with our own meaning. I certainly found myself wrestling at the end of college. I applied to divinity school and got in and delayed my enrollment for a year because I was wrestling at that time with my comfort in life. I had felt very kind of comfortable, almost sedentary in my existence, and I felt like I needed to go somewhere else to be exposed to the world. And my friend had applied to this program with the Lutheran and Presbyterian churches, young adults in global mission, so going to another country and living there for a year. So I applied and went to a discernment event in Indiana, and there were 3 countries that I was interested in: Thailand, Kenya, and Scotland. Very different countries. I don't know why. Well, they wouldn't let any males go to Thailand. There was a prostitution problem, so no males to Thailand. So it was Kenya or Scotland, and I interviewed with both of their country reps, and it became clear to me that I needed to really kind of be put out of my comfort zone. Scotland wasn't going to be enough to challenge me to think more broadly than my little kind of context in which I had grown up. So I was accepted into the Kenya program, and I went home, flew back to college, and called my mom after getting off the plane. And my mom, was a little hesitant, but she was fine. This will be a good experience for you. It'll be a good adventure, and I'm sure it'll be great. And she didn't say a whole lot. She said, "Hang on a second, your dad wants to talk to you." And I hadn't really shared a lot of my discernment at this point, so he picked up the phone. I said, "I got into the Kenya program. I'm going to go to Kenya." And he paused, and he said, "Well, Sanf," this is how he talks, if you bite the bullet, you bite the bullet. At least you know Jesus, so you'll know where you're going." "Dad, I'm not going to die. At least I hope I'm not going to die." "Well, you never know," he said. Turns out I did go to Kenya. He never visited me, though. So there's a way, though, that thinking about death, kind of proximity to death, whether it's far off or whether it's close at hand, death puts things in perspective for us. And I think the prospect of death put things in perspective for Jacob, too. He had a moment as that day started to break, and God said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." Kind of implicitly, you're in danger here. Jacob could have let go. He could have said, "You know what? It's not worth it to me." I could have said, "You know what? I'll just stay. I'll just stay in America, and I'll start divinity school in North Carolina, and I'll just be safe. I won't put myself out there like that." But a lot of times in our striving, in our wrestling with God, in our wrestling with this life of ours, especially as people of faith, death is not as scary as it is for a lot of other people. We don't have a lot to fear around death. We know the end. It's assured to us by Christ because of the love of God that does all the work for us, and yet we still find ourselves wrestling, engaged in that battle, no matter what's going on, all the way to the bitter end. Speaking of the end, before the end, God tries a maneuver on Jacob. He wants to be let go. He wants this thing to be over. And so he goes and he strikes Jacob in the hip socket, it says. And so Jacob is now kind of injured. I'm sure it hurt. And yet Jacob did not let go. And we know that it hurt because after it's all said and done, at the very end, Jacob walks away limping. He has been marked by this struggle with God. He has been wounded. He has been bruised. And he walks away with this limp. I'm not very athletic. And I'm not a big fan of wrestling either. I've never really watched wrestling. I don't understand it, just like I don't understand most sports. But when I was at St. Paul's School, one of my students was on the wrestling team, and I said, I tried to watch all their different matches. And so I went to this wrestling match one winter, and he was a 10th grader, kind of a littler guy. And I was sitting next to one of the other teachers who had gone to, her son was a wrestler, and so she went to every wrestling match, and she knew what was going on. And I was just fascinated. There's so much movement and kind of limbs flailing, and it seemed very chaotic. And she assured me, no, it's very coordinated. They all know what they're doing. I said, okay. Well, all of a sudden, my student's wrestling there, and the whistle blows. The referee steps in, and I have no idea what's going on. The student grabs his nose, And he gets up, and the coach and the athletic trainer come out to the mat, and you can see his hand is covered in blood. His nose had started to bleed. And they took him off, and they're, cleaning him up. Someone comes out and wipes up the mat because it's, gross now, because it wasn't gross before, I guess. And I lean over and I say, oh, thank goodness the ref, blew the whistle with the, the blood everywhere and the bloody nose. And I was about to say, and I'm so glad that, little whatever his name was is going to get to go home now and can kind of heal up from his bloody nose. But before I could even say that, the athletic trainer takes 2 cotton balls, jams them up his nose. The coach slaps him on the back, and he goes back out and continues the match. And I looked over at Bonnie, was the name of the faculty member. I'm like, what is going on here? She's like, they've got to finish the match. And I was like, why? But that's how it is. Even though we get injured, even though we're struggling, even though we're kind of in the thick of it, and we're literally sometimes bleeding, we can't just give up. We can't just quit. It's not how this works. We have to strive. We have to struggle. We have to wrestle until we get what it is that we've realized we've come for. And for Jacob, what he's come for is a blessing. I actually personally don't think that he realized that until he was halfway through the struggle. I think when he started wrestling, he just kind of did what he thought he had to do. But by halfway through, he realizes who this person is. This is God. And what does God have that maybe we need? Jacob realizes it's a blessing. And so Jacob holds on for dear life. And he wrestles and wrestles until he says, the man asks him his name, Jacob. The man says, he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me, Jacob says. He refuses to leave until the blessing is given. And then the God, says, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. God changes his name. He changes his name. And God makes Jacob the official line of Israel. He takes what was kind of a scam job on Jacob's part, and he makes it official. We see this striving as well in the gospel with that persistent widow and the unjust judge who continues to persist over and over and over until justice is given. And in our lives, we strive too. The danger, I think the danger as Christians is that we see God in a transactional light. We see God as kind of a genie in a bottle that all we have to do is ask God. I'm going to pray to God that I am X, healed, restored in relationship, that my job improves, or I'm given a new job, that I would have meaning and purpose. Tell me the answers, oh God. And we expect to kind of ask and then just be given. But I think the gospel is far more engaged than that. Because life with God is not about a transaction between you and God. Life with God is about a relationship with God. A relationship. Last little vignette I have for you. I did a wedding yesterday, and I'm a single guy, not married. I've never been married. And sometimes in my wedding homily, I talk about the math of marriage. And I get this from my mother. So my dad got his moment, my mom's going to get her moment. She tells me that marriage, the math of marriage is that it's not 50-50. And if you're married, I might see some nodding. It's not 50-50, it's 85-15. You've got to put in 85% of the work, and you expect only 15% back. I don't know if that's a condemnation on my father, but I'll leave that up to you. But in marriage, you find yourself engaged in kind of a wrestling match of sorts. Again, not in a violent way, but really in a trying to understand the other and trying to accept the other. And that takes work. It takes work. And why would it be any different with God? If we really believe and love God and believe God's promises for us, that God accepts us as we are, for who we are, undeserving of anything we've done, then that acceptance comes at the cost of having to kind of wrestle to figure each other out. You've got to wrestle with God to figure out who God is. And God wants to wrestle with you to figure out who you are, because sometimes we don't know who we are until we're really engaged. with one another. So may you and I wrestle, just like Jacob. May we not be too battered or bruised, although we might be a little bit. We might walk away a little bit scathed. But may we be blessed because we have wrestled with God, we've striven with God and persevered so that we might know God, so that God might know us. And in that knowledge, may we be accepted and loved through the wrestling. Amen.